that we published. That was released last April 2019, with some updates based on information that we've been gathering since its release. And before I get started, I just wanted to thank our funders, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, College Futures Foundation, and the Sutton Family Fund for funding this work. And I'd also like to thank the California Community College Chancellor's Office for providing us with the student level longitudinal data that is absolutely foundational to this research. And then we'd also like to thank the faculty that we interviewed for this research for their very important insights that helped to inform this research. So without any further ado, let's begin. Oops. Okay, so the California Community College system serves an important role in educating the largest number of underserved students in the state, and especially students, especially non-native English students. So we see about tens of thousands of ESL students that enroll in the community colleges, and they enroll for a variety of different reasons. Some enroll to improve their English speaking skills in order to gain jobs or even to seek a degree and transfer. So the California Community College system provides a very unique opportunity to facilitate the economic and social mobility of these non-native speaking students. And so the thing is that there's very little evidence that is known about what ESL programs look like and in the California Community College system, and how degree-seeking students are doing in achieving their educational goals if they do get through these programs. And so our research aims to contribute data-driven insights into what these ESL programs look like on a systematic level, and who are the students that these programs are serving, and whether or not these programs are helping or hindering student success, especially given the statewide and grassroots reforms that are currently underway in this space. So just to begin, I know probably a lot of you already know what AB 705 is, but I'll just briefly give an overview of the main function of this bill. And so basically this is legislation that was passed sometime in 2017, I believe October, and it basically requires colleges to reform how they place students into remedial coursework. And what this means specifically for ESL students is that colleges must maximize the probability that a student in credit ESL, so those are ESL courses that students have to pay for, so they have to maximize the probability that these students will enter and complete transfer level English within 3 years. And the bill also mandates that colleges utilize assessment and placement policies that will maximize this probability that they will complete in 3 years. And then finally, there was an initial full implementation date of fall 2020, but given the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Chancellor's Office has come out with guidance that will delay this requirement of achieving full implementation by fall 2021. And in addition to this, they are also extending assessments of ESL placement mechanisms to summer 2021. And there's also additional guidance in that students who have completed high school that are ESL students should be placed into English in accordance with Title V. So these are some of the latest updates with regards to guidance from the Chancellor's Office. And so it's important to note here that this law, in the context of ESL, targets a very specific subpopulation of the ESL ESL students. Basically, those students with goals to seek a degree or transfer, or those students that are enrolled in courses that will lead to transfer level English. Okay, so now I'll just give a brief overview of who our general ESL population is comprised of. So first, for the purposes of our research, we define an ESL student as any student that has taken at least one ESL course sometime from the 2009-10 academic year to the 2014-15 academic year. And this totals to around 356,000 students that comprise this general ESL population. But then we separate the general population into two separate groups. And first, we have non-sequence students, and we define these students as students who take an ESL course that does not lead to transfer level English. And as we can see, this is a slight majority of our general ESL population at 53%. And then we also have sequence students, and these are students that do take a course that leads to transfer level English. And we see that there's a slight minority of our general ESL population at 47%. And then within the sequence student population, we have these degree-seeking ESL students. And we basically identify ESL students as degree seekers based on their course-taking behavior. More specifically, we identify these students as they have taken at least one course that leads to transfer level English. But in addition to that, they also take one course, one developmental math or English course, or a degree applicable course. And so we see that these comprise 34%, these students comprise 34% of the general ESL population, and it's this 34% that is the focus of our research. Okay, so what do our degree-seeking ESL students look like? So in this slide, I'll highlight 3 key demographic characteristics of our ESL degree-seeking population. And we find that these students are more likely to be Asian, Latino, or white, hold permanent residency, student visa status, or US citizenship status, or are coming in into the California Community College system with a foreign high school diploma or US high school diploma. And it's also important to note that there are educational differences across racial and ethnic groups as well. More specifically, we find that Latino students are more likely to be US high school graduates, and more than any other racial and ethnic group within this degree-seeking population. And Latino students are also more likely to be US citizens compared to any other race or ethnic group. So now that we know who our ESL degree-seeking students are, what are the programs structured like that they take? So using information collected from a comprehensive scan of colleges, catalogs, websites, and course schedules, also in interviews with faculty on the ground, we've identified 3 main ways that colleges are reforming their ESL sequences. And I will be illustrating that to you all today. And so here I have an illustration of 2 examples of how colleges model their ESL sequence. The one on the left is the more traditional way that colleges have offered ESL. And the right exhibits how the 3 main ways colleges are reforming their sequences can look like. So first, we find that colleges are reforming their ESL sequences by integrating their sequences. And basically what this means is that colleges, in the more traditional way of offering ESL, the discrete skills that are taught in ESL, namely reading, writing, listening, speaking, and grammar, are taught as separate courses, and each of those courses the student needs to take in order to progress through the sequence. And so what they find in integrated courses, we find that these courses actually combine the discrete skills into a single course per level of the sequence. So this effectively reduces the number of courses that a student takes per level of the sequence. And we find that about 44% of colleges are integrating their sequences. And then next, we find that colleges are also moving away from requiring students to complete additional levels of developmental English upon completing the ESL sequence, but before they're able to access transfer level English. And now we find that these colleges are actually allowing students to enroll directly into transfer level English before upon completing the ESL sequence. And so this effectively reduces the number of levels that a student needs to go through in order to reach transfer level English. And we find that about 60% of colleges have these sequences that feed the ESL sequence directly into transfer level English. And then finally, we also find that colleges are conferring transfer or degree applicable credit in courses that comprise the highest levels of the ESL sequence. And I want to note here that these courses are still below transfer level English, but they confer elective credit to the UC and CSU. And we find about 58% of colleges are offering these type of courses. We've also learned in our research that more colleges are increasingly getting approval to have these courses confer humanities credit to the UC and CSU as well. And so it's these three common reforms in these ESL sequences that I just highlighted that'll be the focus of our analysis for this research. But there is one reform that I do want to highlight for you all that's gaining a lot of traction. So while we don't focus on this particular ESL reform in our research that we'll be presenting today, it's important to note that we also found in this time frame of our research that there were colleges that were offering a transfer level English that was specifically designed for ESL students. And typically this course was housed within the ESL department. So in a course catalog, it would look something like ESL 101. And it would confer, and the design of which, or like the ideal of which would be for it to confer the same type of credit for general ed requirements. And we found that 5 colleges in the time frame of our study offered this ESL transfer level English. But we didn't include these courses in our analysis because when we actually looked at more closely at the student behavior, the student course taking behavior for students that took this course, we actually found that they ended up taking the regular transfer level English that's normally housed in the English department because these ESL transfer level Englishes only articulated to a few local CSUs or only for specific programs. However, as I mentioned earlier, there's been renewed movement in offering this type of reform, and we found as of the fall 2020 academic semester, so in this current year, we found that 12 colleges are now offering an ESL transfer level English that's either housed within the ESL department, or they're offering sections of transfer level English within the English department, but these sections are taught by ESL faculty. And we've also learned that these courses are increasingly gaining approval, IGETC approval, which will confer freshman level general ed credits that apply to transfer in the CSU and UC. And so that's extremely encouraging for the progress of this particular reform and an improvement upon the trends that I had just mentioned earlier. But again, we don't go into analysis of this particular reform for this research today. So in addition to how these sequences are structured, it's also important to note how many levels within the sequence students are actually needing to go through before they get to transfer level English. And levels are essentially the number of courses that a student needs to complete before reaching transfer level English. And so we find that about half of colleges are offering sequences that are 5 levels or less. And so that would conceivably allow for a student to complete transfer level English within the AB 705 mandated time frame of 3 years. However, we also see that when we look at where students actually start in the sequence, we actually find that a lot of students are starting much closer to transfer level English. So we see that about half of students are actually starting 3 levels or less. So they're starting a lot closer to transfer level English. And then we also find that students that are degree-seeking students that are US high school graduates are actually a larger percentage of them are starting even higher in the sequence as well. And so given this, colleges could conceivably shorten their sequences to achieve AB 705 compliance with relative ease. However, even with colleges that are offering sequences that could allow for a student to complete in 3 years, and even if students are starting closer to transfer level English, is this still enough to maximize that likelihood that a student can complete transfer level English? So we investigate this particular question using our most prominent measure of student success, and that is throughput. And we define throughput as the share of a group of students that completes transfer level English. And we find that if we give students a 3-year time frame to complete transfer level English, we only see that 26% of students are able to make it through transfer level English. And even if we give students like 6 years to complete transfer level English. The overall throughput rate there is just 34%. So these throughput rates also vary drastically depending on where a student starts in the sequence. So using our course scan in combination with our student level longitudinal data, we developed this figure which we refer to as a team as an attrition chart, which illustrates students' progression through the ESL sequence to transfer level English over 3 years as well as 6 years. And this chart kind of looks a little complicated, but I'll be walking you guys through how to interpret this chart. So each line represents the progression of a group of students that starts at a given level within the ESL sequence. And here we choose to highlight 2 particular groups of students. First, we highlight students that start 2 levels below transfer, because these students can theoretically complete transfer level English within 3 terms or 1.5 years, as well as students that start 5 levels below transfer. And these are students that can theoretically complete transfer level English within that AB 705 time frame of 3 years or 6 terms. So each point that along these lines represents the share of that group of students that makes it to the next point in the sequence. So just to take students that start 2 levels below transfer as an example, if we took 100% of students or 100 students that start 2 levels below transfer, we find that 84 end up completing the 2 level below transfer course. Another 60 end up enrolling in the next course in the sequence, so the 1 level below transfer. We find that 53 end up completing that course, and then another 51 enroll in the transfer level English course, and then finally we see that 45 students out of the 100 that initially started in 2 levels below transfer within the sequence end up actually completing transfer level English. And so we see when we compare this to students who start 5 levels below transfer, there's more than a 30 percentage point difference in the completion rate of those students that actually make it through transfer level English. And we find that even when we give students 6 years to complete that, 6 years to go through the ESL sequence, we find that it's pretty much kind of the same picture. We see that for those students who start 2 levels below transfer, only 51% actually make it through the transfer level English, as compared to the 20% of students that start 5 levels below transfer. And so this just seeks to illustrate how the longer these sequences are, the more exit points there are for those students. And just because you have a sequence that theoretically allows a student to complete transfer level English doesn't mean that it's maximizing the likelihood that they may do so. And so those 3 key ESL features that I mentioned earlier on in my presentation, we found through regression analyses that they are associated with an increased likelihood of students completing transfer level English. So more specifically, we find that those ESL courses that confer transfer level credit, again, these are the courses that are below transfer level, but they confer elective credit to this UC or CSU. We find that offering these types of courses confer a 16.1 percentage point increase in the likelihood of students completing transfer level English compared to those students that took courses at the same level but were not offered, but did not confer transfer credit. And we find in our interviews and correspondences with faculty that they attribute this effect to, or this association with how conferring courses for conferring transfer level credit for these courses can help students make tangible progress towards their degree and transfer goals. And they also emphasize the rigor of these courses as college level foreign language work. And in addition, we find that those courses are those sequences that are integrated as compared to taught as the discrete separate skills courses. we find that integrating sequences is associated with an 11.8 percentage point increase in the likelihood of a student completing transfer level English, compared to those students that enrolled and took courses in the more traditional model of offering ESL. And we find that faculty attribute this to how in integrated sequences, it's more likely to receive just-in-time support with necessary skills. So having grammar kind of weaved into, grammar support weaved into reading and writing courses and such. And they also found that in integrated sequences, the courses are more designed with transfer level English course objectives in mind. And they also align much better. They also align reading and writing assignments much better than, say, offering them in discrete separate courses. And then we also find that those sequences that feed directly into transfer level English are associated with a 7.4 percentage point likelihood of increasing the likelihood of students completing transfer level English, compared to those students that that enrolled in sequences where there was that additional layer of developmental English involved. And they found that in sequences where the ESL sequence feeds directly into transfer level English, there's more language support that's weaved in through the sequence structure. So finally, based on what I've presented today, we have a few recommendations and takeaways. And basically that boils down to that there are several ESL reforms that seem especially promising. As I mentioned earlier, shorter ESL sequences, ESL courses that confer transfer credit, integrated approaches to teaching English skills, and direct pathways from ESL to transfer level English are all associated with positive outcomes for students that take advantage of those reforms or enrolled in colleges that implement those reforms. And then finally, we also have some takeaways or recommendations that are informed by our conversations with faculty. More specifically, that seamless connections between non-credit and credit ESL are going to be vital for student success in these programs. More specifically, we found that about 20% of colleges have non-credit coursework that leads to transfer level English. So it'll be important to make sure that these courses, that the non-credit courses that are involved in these sequences feed seamlessly into credit ESL. And then we also heard from faculty that it'll be important to monitor how assessment and placement policies are ensuring accuracy, effectiveness, and equity. And we heard from faculty that it's really important to make sure that the assessment and placement policies are working in tandem with the structural reforms that are currently underway in the ESL space. And then finally, making sure that all ESL students are encouraged to pursue a degree or transfer. As I mentioned earlier, we noticed that in our research that the majority of ESL, the general ESL population, doesn't take a course that leads to transfer level English. So just ensuring that all ESL students are provided the opportunity to be able to pursue a degree or transfer is also important. So that's it from us. Thank you so much for attending. I will hand it over to the audience for any questions that you'd like to ask myself or my colleague Olga Rodriguez. But yes, thank you for your time.
Bonnie, there's a question in the chat that says, can you explain what feed seamlessly from non-credit to credit means? Is it a prerequisite?
I see. Yeah, so to kind of answer that question, we just noticed that there were a few layers that students needed to go through, like within the ESL sequence, if there was non-credit coursework involved. So so basically we found that there was an exit point where students could potentially fall off the sequence pathway if they needed to transition to like taking the credit portion of the ESL sequence. So just making sure that that exit point doesn't exist and is actually remedied. So that's what I mean by seamless connection between non-credit and credit ESL.
There was another. Oh, go ahead.
So this is Olga, and I would add to that point, one of the things that we heard, and maybe Mallory's going to go into it, one of the things that we heard as we were doing this work, as colleges were thinking about what sort of reforms they were going to implement in response to AB 705, we heard that some colleges were going to transition their lower levels of ESL, for example, to non-credit. And so this also related, because we did see some of that happening even prior to the AB 705 discussions. And like Bonnie said, sometimes these transitions didn't happen. And, you know, we saw kind of some greater loss at those points. So as colleges kind of move forward and make those sort of changes to their sequences to comply with AB 705, just to be mindful that whatever this looks like and however it's structured, that this transition from non-credit to credit happens in a way that's smooth, that's effective, and that students actually know, you know, the difference, you know, because often non-credit is attractive because students aren't spending money. But so when they do transition to credit, it does imply, you know, tuition and books and other fees. So yeah, just kind of clarity around this and a lot of information if this is happening and if this is the sort of direction your college may be taking.
Did you look at any schools? There's a comment in the chat that says not all colleges have non-credit courses. Our district has a non-credit school that is separate from the 2 credit offering colleges.
Yeah, so our research includes those colleges where they have a full credit sequence, where the pathway to transfer level English in ESL is all credit courses. And then we also look at colleges where there is like Olga was saying, they offer some the lower levels of the ESL sequence as non-credit, and then there's a transition point where once you go into the higher levels, those are credit courses. So yeah, and in total we have about 101 colleges that are represented in our research. And yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything there, Olga.
No, I think that's good. And then also related to kind of, because I know there have been, there's a lot of interest to kind of have a better sense of how many colleges are innovating in the transfer level comp space, either through the ESL pathway or through the English department by creating separate courses aiming, or sometimes even taught by ESL faculty certified to teach college comp. And so we're continuing to monitor that. I know Kathy Wada shared a list of some of the colleges that are innovating in this space. At least from the English side, as part of another project at PPIC, we are looking at English department courses that are for multilingual speakers and that are providing that core requisite support. But at this moment, we don't have those outcomes, but that is definitely something that we'll be continued to monitor, kind of how the colleges progress in this space. And also, somebody asked about offering humanities credit for the levels below transfer. That's another point that we want to continue to monitor, because we did find that even offering elective credit, transfer elective credit for these courses is helping improve outcomes. So giving them actual G credit for transfer could potentially even boost some of what we were finding. And I think this is kind of probably something that's very unique to California, that, you know, actually kind of giving students credit for the rigor of learning a second language, or a third or fourth in this case, is kind of it's actually a very kind of a strengths and asset-based approach to ESL. So it's really encouraging to see more of this movement, and I think a lot of it is kind of spurred and motivated by reforms related to AB 705. So.
There was a question about the most successful ways that colleges have gotten transfer credit for ESL.
And well, our research doesn't really like comment on that. Maybe some of like the faculty like interviews that we conducted may have hinted on that, but that wasn't something that was the focus of our research.
No,
so
but I
maybe
wouldn't.
for I was going to say for the people here, they could add in the chat.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's something that I think that people on the ground that are actually like in the process of like applying for that articulation and like that those credits could probably speak to a lot better.
I know that in future, our upcoming sessions, both Dwayne from Sac City and then Lawrence have both spoke to us about some of their processes and going through with this. So that could be a question that might be able to come and have there too.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Olga and Bonnie, you want to take a look at the chat and see if there's any other points that you didn't. I think we've hit most of them. I think we can go ahead maybe and then hand it over to Craig and Mallory, and then we should have some more time for Q&A at the end, so we can come back to any questions that might come up. Yeah, so I believe, Mallory, you're going to go ahead and start.
Yes, great, thank you. And then there's a question in the chat about posting this. Yes, Summer will be posting this presentation to the CAP website when this is complete. So as Summer mentioned, my colleague Craig, he's going to be loading up our presentation. And I'm Mallory Newell. I'm the Director of Institutional Research and Planning at De Anza College and part of the Multiple Measure Assessment Project team for the RP group. And Craig will introduce himself in a second here, but our presentation will kind of drill into some of the things that the PPIC went into as well. And we're also going to be sharing some new results from the 8705 implementation survey that went out this past spring, just prior to COVID. And it talks about a lot of these sequences that we were talking about and the changes that departments are making. Craig, thanks for getting that loaded up. Would you like to introduce yourself? You might be on mute.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Craig Hayward, Dean of Institutional Effectiveness at Bakersfield College and MMAP research team member. And I'll be co-presenting with Mallory today.
All right, so first we'll start with the next slide, which we'll jump into the 8705 implementation survey results. And the survey, like I mentioned, was administered in early spring, and we finished up right before everything was shut down for COVID. We had 73 responses out of the 114 colleges, so we had a response rate of around 64%. So when we are viewing these results, the majority of the questions are out of the 73 respondents, okay? That bit.ly link will take you to the full survey, and of course this will be posted after. So very similar to what PPIC was mentioning is that colleges, the credit ESL departments have largely integrated their multiple strands where we were see different strands of reading, writing, even listening, speaking strands integrated into one strand. And so for this one, we see 49% have already completed that, and 19% are in the progress of that, and this is as of last spring. So when we combine those together, we have 70% of our respondents in the process or having completed the integration of the multiple strands into one integrated strand, which PPIC found to be effective in increasing throughput. The other curricular change that we found to be in implementation or already can be completed is where the colleges, again, are transitioning students directly into transfer level English or transfer level ESL rather than into basic skills English. And so we have 62% that have already completed that and 25% in progress. So when we put those together, we have 87% of our respondents doing that transition. So instead of putting students into basic skills English, putting them into a transfer level English or ESL equivalent once they've completed the ESL sequence. So on the next slide, the survey results show how colleges, the credit ESL departments are placing students. So we know that for ESL, we're still able to use assessment tests, but then also a lot of colleges have begun to use guided self-placement and other means. So Craig, if you're able to advance me. Thank you. So this slide is looking at the assessment measures used for our English language learners who are U.S. high school graduates. So the highest rated use of assessment here is assessment tests for students, English language learners who graduated from high school, those with less than 4 years of high school completed, and those with a GED or high school proficiency. And so that's somewhere close to 50% of colleges are using an assessment test. And then that's followed by self-reported high school data. And those are for high school graduates and those with proficiency. And remember with Title V, it recommends that the colleges place high school graduates into, well, I guess not recommends, it is in Title V, that they place those students using high school transcripts rather than assessment tests. So there should be that transition moving forward as we implement this survey moving forward, that more colleges will be using high school data to place those high school graduates rather than assessment tests, similar to these colleges that are using the self-reported high school data. And then the third most used is the guided self-placement. So we see 41% across the board for these different groups using a guided or self-placement tool. And then when we go to the next slide, when we look at adult ed students, so those students who did not complete high school in the US, we see that assessment tests again are the most widely used. And then this is followed by guided or self-placement. And then some colleges are able to somehow collect some level of self-reported high school data, even though they may not have completed high school for placement. And then other assessment measures are used at a quarter, a little over a quarter, 27%. And then essays are still being used for this population as well. And then our last group are our international students. So we have two groups of international students that we asked about, which are those from countries of origin that use English as a language of instruction and those who do not use English as a language of instruction. And again, we see assessment tests being widely used for these groups, around 50%. And then this was followed by guided or self-placement, and then self-reported high school data, and also transcripts, international transcripts converted to a US GPA scale, also being used as another form of assessment. And then we have 15 to 17% also using an essay. So you can still see there's wide variability in the types of assessments that are being used across the state, but much less reliance on a test than in the past, and much more reliance on other measures such as guided self-placement, self-reported high school transcript data, which we see increasing from prior years that we've implemented this survey. All right, so then when we move on to the next slide, and we asked the ESL departments to report to us what they have done or they plan to do around curricular changes. So after the other response, they selected specialized tutoring assistants. So tutoring, continuing to do tutoring or promoting tutoring moving forward in the tutoring center, or using faculty customized supports where faculty designed tutoring modules that are either part of a class or conducted at the tutoring center. And then the next most widely used curricular change that has been implemented or will be implemented is embedded support, such as embedded tutoring or an embedded counselors within credit ESL courses. And then when you look at co-requisite support, there are 11 colleges that reported using an ESL course linked to a credit co-requisite support course. And then there were 6 with an unlinked credit course and 5 with a non-credit support course. So if you add all of those up, there's 22 colleges that were doing some type of co-requisite support in ESL last spring. And there may be more now. So I was just curious in the chat if you wouldn't mind typing in if your college is doing some type of concurrent support or co-requisite support, and how that support is being implemented. Then we can kind of all just read through and learn from your different colleges about how the co-requisite support is being done. So then that moves us on to we asked about other curricular changes that they have already completed, plan to complete, might complete, or do not plan to complete. And this is very similar to the findings that PPIC shared. So the most already completed response was that ESL pathway that transitions students to the highest level credit ESL or into ESL coursework. We talked about these first 2, and then the integrating the sequences. And then the third is an interesting one. So it's ESL pathway that allows a credit ESL faculty to teach English composition to ESL students. And that was 25% of colleges already are doing it, and another 17% plan to do that. And then the other ones all kind of follow along the lines of getting transfer credit for the ESL courses, either through transfer level equivalent to English or the humanities. So revising ESL courses to fulfill transfer requirements for UC, for CSU, and the CSU C2 and IGETC were all areas that ESL departments have already completed or plan to implement. All right, and then lastly from the survey results, I found these to be very interesting. The most requested resources that the departments said that they needed to help maximize throughput of their students is resources on best practices and examples of successful implementation. So really knowing what other colleges are doing as models that seem to be working so that we can learn from one another. And that was 70% of respondents, 51 colleges. And then the second most requested was professional development around employee training, curriculum design, co-requisite support, and faculty learning communities. And then third was dedicated funding to support AB 705 implementation based on local needs. And so in other venues, I've heard the Chancellor's Office really promoting that the student equity, the integrated plan funds, which used to be the student equity funds, the CIA funds, should be used for these purposes. And if you have any BSOT grants that are still functioning on your campus, can be used for those purposes. But using it, the existing pots of money, the largest being the student equity funds for this work. And then other responses for resource requests at 62% was guidance on developing self-placement and guided placement tools, and then guidance on assessment tests to evaluate English language proficiency for non-native English learners. So I thought these were very interesting resource requests from the field. So that wraps up the results for the survey, and this will be posted so you can review the whole survey results. But so now I'm going to turn it over to Craig to dig into the data around our ESL populations.
All right, thanks very much, Mallory. Good afternoon, everybody. Craig Hayward here again, and I'm going to share with you the research that the Multiple Measures Assessment Project research team conducted for the AB 705 Advisory ESL Committee and for the Chancellor's Office. And a lot of the research questions that we examine are thanks to the input and feedback from the subcommittee members who are listed here on your screen. So thanks to them. thanks to the Chancellor's Office as well for supporting our research efforts. Thought I'd start off this segment with just a heads up, something new in Title V. If you haven't seen this, it's interesting that the Chancellor's Office is kind of on the hook and engaged in the process to collect and analyze all placement methods and their impact on throughput rates for ESL students. So this is something in Title V, and we can look forward to hearing more about this and being more engaged in this, I think all of us on this call today. Because the report to the Board of Governors is due January 30th, 2022. So a little less than a year and a half away. Something on the horizon. So as was implied in the implementation survey and the way that Mallory was breaking out the results of different questions for different sort of subtypes or subgroups of English language learner students, we found in our analysis that after doing some initial overall analyses of English language learners, that it was important to really understand progression through ESL curriculum to do a few things. One of them was to disaggregate the population of English language learners into at least 3 major groups that you see on your screen. And it's, again, this is for the AB 705 Advisory Committee and the ESL Subcommittee. So we're really focusing in on credit students who are degree and transfer oriented. And when we look at the proportion of students that these 3 subgroups represent, we get about 37% of all English language learners. They're a very large population of non-credit students, and we have a different study that looks at non-credit students. But today we're really focusing on the credit students, and they represent about a little over 1/3. So it's interesting, it converges with the numbers that, thanks Kathy, I'm gonna download that. Just a second here. It's getting some updates from Kathy on the GE approvals, which is kind of a hot topic, as you know. So interesting to see these numbers converge across very different methodologies that PPIC was using, kind of a sequence behavior, and we were looking at sort of student typology, and we also looked at ed goal, what students were telling us about their intention in terms of seeking a degree or seeking to transfer, or both. So the first population that we really engaged with in depth was the English language learners who are US high school graduates. And a little bit about the methodology. We had data on a lot of students. We followed them for up to 3 years, which is the time limit, the time clock on the AB 705, and that we focused on students from 2004 through 2018. So this was the data file. And these are the research questions that were developed in collaboration with and partnership with the AB 705 Advisory Subcommittee, ESL Subcommittee. The first research question is really the biggest, and we'll kind of cover the results that we found from most of these in the presentation today. This document and the other documents that we're producing are available on the RP Group website, or will be shortly. The first of the 3 groups, the ELL US high school graduates, that paper will be posted, I believe, today or Monday, shortly. Any minute now, we're waiting for it to be posted. So that will be, the full paper will be available. But we'll cover the highlights here today of these 6 research questions. One of the other big kind of ideas that we had to realize when looking at English language learners, particularly relevant with US high school graduates who are English language learners, is that in addition to this typology, we needed to look at English pathways as well as ESL pathways. In a sense, students have a choice when they enter the community college, a choice, or there's a direction that, you know, either way, they're going to be pursuing one pathway or the other that can lead to transfer level English or transfer level English ESL equivalent completion. And so we have really 4 groups. So all of the US high school graduates start together. They either are directed or choose to enter the English pathway or the ESL pathway. And what we found in our research is that 86 to 87% of students, US high school graduates who are English language learners, enter the English pathway. So it's a minority of students who are directed to the ESL pathway historically. And then once they're on the English pathway, they can either go straight to transfer level English or they can go into developmental. Of course, post AB 705, they would be going directly into transfer level English in virtually every case. The ESL pathway, there is a multi-level ESL pathway, kind of the traditional ESL pathway that we were reviewing earlier, or a streamlined pathway, which we examined. It was kind of a hypothetical pathway that the advisory committee wanted us to look at. So we have 3 groups, we have 4 pathways. It gets a little complicated. When we look at the history, just look at a 3-year throughput rate historically for students coming out of high school who enter ESL or who enter the English pathway. And historically, of course, the English pathway, they may have entered at up to 4 levels below because the majority of these students were entering the developmental pathway. So we used a 3-year time frame for both pathways when we looked historically. We see that the throughput rates are higher for English language learner US high school graduate students who enter the English pathway. They're 42% versus 24% for those who go into the ESL pathway. We also looked at this theoretical best case scenario for students who enter 1 level below ESL, and they're in a school where it feeds directly into transfer level English, and they enroll in transfer level English in the next term. And we find that that does increase the throughput, although it's not necessarily representative of the experience of most students who enter the ESL pathway. So this graph is meant to show that we've done a little bit of adjustment for students entering transfer level English, because historically there was a tendency for students who entered directly into transfer level English to have higher high school GPA than those who were put in developmental. So when we adjust for that, the 71% comes down to 69%. And when we look at that hypothetical streamlined ESL pathway, the throughput rate goes all the way up to 64%, which is still less than the 69%, but it's comparable. And students, per legislation, AB 1805, students need to be informed and aware that they have a choice of taking an ESL pathway or an English pathway. So if they were to take an ESL pathway, this sort of stepping stone approach of going directly into a 1 level below that feeds directly into transfer level English can be an effective pathway, as can, of course, entering directly into transfer level English. So another question that came up often in conversations about US high school graduates who are English language learners is the number of years that they had to have engaged in the US education system in high school, and whether that was relevant. But we found when we looked at this question and we tried to look very carefully at schools where we could be sure that a student's missing record meant that they really weren't enrolled at that school. And we looked, we categorized students as having either complete high school records, which is the group over on the far right, or having 3 years of data, which would be the next group over to the left, 2 years of data, and then on the far left, students who had just 1 year of high school records in the US. And there are a couple of comparisons to look at here. The green, the bar in the middle, the dark green bar represents the throughput rate for students who, with that number of years of high school, went into English. They took the English pathway. And the orange and gray bar represents the throughput for English language learners with that numbers of years of experience in a US high school who went into the ESL pathway. And so in every case, the number of years, there was a difference, a pretty big difference, where the English pathway was resulting in higher throughput. And then we did an analysis, since this is historical, we looked at the projected throughput for students in 1 year on an English pathway if they all were to go into transfer level instead of into developmental levels. Then it's clear that the throughput in the English sequence would be much higher. So our conclusion was there wasn't really strong evidence that the number of years that a student had participated in US high school had any bearing on whether they should be directed to the ESL pathway or the English pathway. And so that actually resulted in a change to Title V, or it supports the change to Title V that's on this screen, where you can see in B2 at the bottom that's underlined, students who have acquired a United States high school diploma or the equivalent shall be placed according to section 55522, which is the multiple measures. So that should be placed according to their high school transcript information. Which brings us to the next research question that we examined in this for the advisory group with this data set. And it explores the idea of whether there should be a question, as is commonly used either formally or informally, to direct students to take either an ESL assessment or an English assessment. And sometimes it's a bit of a conundrum, because it's almost like you need a test to tell you which test to take, and there isn't really that test. Should you take the ESL test or the English test? So often it just comes down to a conversation, or there might be a question or two, such as the one on your screen: are you comfortable reading and writing English? And so this is a question that's actually asked. It's present on the application for community college and CCC Apply. So we dug in and used this data to see if students who said that they were not comfortable reading and writing English, who were English language learners in high school, if that they would perform better, they'd have better throughput to transfer level English if they were on the ESL pathway. But we did not find that that was the case. And even if they said they were not comfortable reading and writing English, they had higher throughput on the ESL. If they entered the English pathway, they had a 33% throughput rate. Whereas if they entered the ESL pathway, they only had a 13% throughput rate in 3 years. So the result was that questions like this really aren't effective in telling you, helping you understand which pathway is going to maximize students' likelihood of completing transfer level English. Okay, so that's a lot about the English language learner US high school students. The other two groups we've explored, and we're going to explore more deeply going ahead. Right now we have an active data collection underway for our international students, so we'll be able to dig in a little deeper. But I want to share with you today some of the initial findings that we have regarding international students, which can be a fairly large piece of the ESL population at some colleges, not very significant at other colleges. It varies. So this is kind of like non-credit ESL. This is going to vary widely from college to college, whether there's a big representation. So one of the things that we see, and down below you can see the sample size of the students, international students, is that only about 1 in 3 international students start on the English path. So 2 out of 3 start on the ESL path. So this is different than what we saw with US high school graduates, where the large majority were entering English. Here we have the large majority entering the ESL pathway. And of those who entered the English pathway, about half are starting at transfer level English. So they're pretty clearly ready to engage in transfer level English work. And then on the ESL path, there's a distribution from a small group being fortunate enough to get into transfer level ESL, or rather English equivalent ESL class, and the rest being distributed pretty equally between 1 level below, 2 levels below, 3 levels below, with a sizable group at 4 levels below, and just 1 out of 20 being placed 5 levels below, and none being placed below that. So that's kind of how the traditional placement of international students stacks up. And then when we look at their throughput rates, we can see that that placement is pretty strongly correlated with their eventual throughput within 3 years. And so students placed into transfer level English ESL equivalent or placed directly into transfer level English have really outstanding throughput rates. 1 level below, still fair, you know, above 60%. And actually, it's not a huge difference between English and ESL throughput, whether, you know, when you're 1 level below or 2 levels below. Of course, going forward, the English pathway is going to really comprise the transfer level. The developmental component of the English pathway per AB 705 really isn't going to be an option for these students going forward. But it's interesting to see that there wasn't a huge difference between the ESL path or the English path. Of course, there's a lot we don't know about the international students, and that box is just to call our attention to the throughput rates being above 50% for all groups when they're placed at transfer level or 1 or 2 levels below. And then the last thing we want to share with you today about international students, we looked at their country of origin and looked at whether that made a difference, whether we saw a pattern of ESL pathway throughput rate being higher or lower for different groups versus the English pathway throughput being higher or lower. Of course, some of these countries have, you know, English is one of the official languages, you know, in the Philippines and in India. So that may have an impact on their schooling. We don't really see that having a big impact. The Asian group has a really strong throughput rate, really from ESL or from English, although it is higher on English, and we see that pattern consistent of the English pathway having higher throughput rates than the ESL pathway for different language groups. And then our final group, the third group, which we've kind of just started calling adult ed. They're the other group, we call them a third group. They're the non-US high school graduates. They're not international students, but they're the only way we know that they're English language learners, therefore, is that they're taking ESL classes. So they're degreed transfer seeking students who are in the ESL pathway, or they're engaged with the ESL curriculum. And they've told us in their ed goal that they're degree or transfer seeking. So we took a different approach with this group because we really didn't know that much about them, and we couldn't compare English versus ESL throughput. We didn't have any high school grades for them because they're not US high school graduates. So we compared across colleges and wanted to see if there was any consistent pattern across colleges. Are these students performing the same at all colleges, or are they performing differently? And it turned out this is really a straightforward, yes, yeah, I'm looking at Ellen's question in the chat. That's one of the issues. So those are just descriptive statistics at this point, Ellen. We're not concluding that all international students should be put in the English pathway and they'll therefore do better, because it's certainly true, could be true, we don't know how true, we assume there's some truth to it, that the more prepared, the students with more stronger English backgrounds were being placed into the English pathway. That being said, so that's why we're engaged in the current research to get more data about our international students. Because we don't have high school transcripts to look at, we need other data sources. So that's what we're looking at right now. So back to the third group here, we see a very strong correlation. We also see a wide distribution. What we're looking at in this graph is the relationship between the average placement of this third group, these adult ESL students, into levels below. So, and each dot represents a college in the state. So a college where there was a sizable number of students in this group, at least 30, and many had many more than that. But we drew the line at 30 because, you know, where it's a group that the college has really had an opportunity to kind of think about and engage with. So some colleges are on average placing this group only 1 or 2 or even 3 levels below. But then there's a cluster of colleges that are placing the average placement level of these students is 4 or 5 or 6 levels below. So again, we have to ask ourselves, is this really the same group of students that at all of the colleges, or is it that the colleges that are on average placing students in this group 5 levels below, those students are somehow very different than the students at the colleges that are placing this group on average 2 levels below. So that's the next slide. The R-square shows this is a very strong relationship. It explains about 50% of the variability in student throughput, just understanding the average level below placement. But it, there are these questions about whether that's really similar. This third group, are they really similar across all of the colleges? And so we wanted to bring in more demographic factors. And so the next analysis, we use demographic controls, and it actually strengthens the relationship when we bring in these additional variables. The R-square value goes from about 0.5 to 0.68. So we're explaining more variation. But once you take out the effect of age, ethnicity, language group, citizenship status, the relationship between average placement and throughput remains. So it's not the case that, another way, and I'm sorry if this is getting too in the weeds of the statistics of it all, but just another way to just say this is that even after you kind of equate age, ethnicity, language group, and citizenship status across colleges, the influence of average placement level remains. That relationship that we originally saw is not due to differences among the colleges on ethnicity or age, language group, or citizenship status. It's due to differences in how those colleges process students and place them, and the average placement levels that result as an effect of that system or that process of placing. So I see I've got some questions in the text. I'll circle back around. We're in the summary here, so we're going to have some time for some Q&A. And I'll get caught up with those. So just a quick summary about some kind of high-level takeaways from the ELL. We looked at ed goal using we looked at ed goal using the students declared ed goal. So their informed ed goal for the full paper on ELL US high school graduates is what we used. And we found that about 88–89% of students have an explicit ed goal that's degree or transfer seeking of recent or rather ELL US high school graduates, not necessarily recent, but they have a high school diploma from the US. So it's the majority, and that even when they didn't have an explicit ed goal of transfer or degree, that they often had high levels of throughput rate. There was one exception, which was the group of students who said that their ed goal was to improve their basic skills. Those students did not have high throughput rates, but it's a bit of a chicken and egg question about whether they might have chosen that informed ed goal because they were placed into an ESL sequence, the purpose of which was to improve their basic skills in English. And then as a result of that, had lower throughput as well. So consider all ELL US high school graduates to be degree seeking by default, even if they present with an undecided goal, which is actually not uncommon. But it's likely that they will end up being able to use that transfer level English. So it's a hold harmless strategy to consider that to be part of their goal. The track switch question, unless that's been rigorously validated, steer away from using those kinds of one-off questions or informal assessments to steer students to either an English pathway versus the ESL pathway, vice versa. And very similar to the recommendations from the PPIC study, Streamlining Esl Sequences. We didn't get into this, but there in the full paper, there's a section on the complexity of curriculum and the schools that have more complex curriculum, which is operationalized as students taking multiple courses, multiple ESL courses across multiple ESL top codes in their first semester. So in other words, the curriculum has more of that sort of, it's not a single integrated core. It has multiple courses that students engage in at each step, or at least at the initial step. That those schools that have that tended to have lower average throughput for their students. So streamlining ESL sequences, focusing on the integrated core. And so, yeah, this may seem to be common sense, and I think it is, but maybe it isn't. If you place students higher, you tend to have higher throughput rate. The counterfactual, or the other result that might have been expected, is that placing students higher might have resulted in more students failing or more students dropping out or being unable to move forward, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So I think there's encouragement here to sort of push ourselves to look at our cut scores and our placements and think about whether there are ways to shift students higher in the sequence in ways that doesn't compromise their learning and their need for instruction. This is some final points about the structure of the study. And when we're thinking about English language learners, it's important to realize they don't all enter ESL curriculum. And so part of that disambiguation for us was to start referring to this larger group of students as English language learners instead of ESL students, because that conflates the students' characteristics with the curriculum that they may or may not enter. So we have English language learners who are entering the English pathway, and we have English language learners who are entering the ESL pathway. And that just helped us clarify our thinking about what's going on with this population of English language learners. And then, of course, the ed goal and program of study data are really important, and understanding what your students want to do. And we can see kind of in the data over the years a trend towards the ed goal becoming better populated and program of study as well. So we salute that improvement in those data elements. It's likely due to all of the work you've all been doing on guided pathways and understanding students' pathways programs and their meta majors. So if we keep that up, we'll be better able to understand which students really need to have us work with them to maximize their probability of completing transfer level English composition or equivalent. So I think that's about it. This is, I'm scanning this slide. I think we've kind of covered these points. And I'm going to hand it back over. Mallory, you still with us there? Talk a little bit about the studies underway.
Sure, yeah. So we are in the process of updating a literature review that we completed, probably been at least a good year or two now, with new studies, because we know that there's new types of ESL curriculum and structures. And so we are seeing if there's any new literature in the field that we could include in our literature review, which is linked there if you want more information about that literature review and the different ways that ESL departments nationally and even internationally are assessing their students. And then Craig alluded to the exploration of international students in credit ESL programs. So we are in the process of reaching out to campuses that have 400 or more ESL students in fall 2019 and asking them for their data. So it would be all of their assessment data, their course enrollment, and their course outcomes data, so that we can look at this similar kinds of trends that we looked at for high school graduates, but with our international students, because we'll have their placement information and their outcomes data. And then we're doing 2 case studies of kind of like promising practices / best practices. One on programs that have high ESL throughput rates, and what are they doing? What do their sequences look like? How are they supporting students? What are their structures? All those different kinds of things we'll be drilling into and doing case studies around those. And then case studies around guided self-placement or self-placement in ESL for those colleges that also have high throughput and guided self-placement practices. So we're hoping to have a lot of that information available to the field in January to support implementation for fall 2021.
And I think we've had a few questions come up in the chat. I've been able to answer, I think most of them in the chat or verbally. But if you have a question you haven't typed in yet, or if we didn't get to your question and we just missed it, feel free to type it in again, or I guess you could come off mute and just shout it out.
I guess you guys did such an amazing job explaining everything so well.
Thank you, Jeff.
There's a couple.
Sylvia, we're going to let me I'll put a bit.ly link in there in the chat where we will be posting the slides. So they're not there yet, but they'll be there shortly.
We'll also put them on the CAP website on the publications page with the recording of the webinar.
I'm actually going to grab the bit.ly link from the presentation.
I don't know if you saw, there's a question what to do about students who fail a level. Is there research as to whether they should be required to repeat the level?
We still have Olga and Bonnie on the call too, so feel free to jump in, Olga and Bonnie. If you, I'm not in Mallory. I don't think that we've really delved into that question.
Not yet. But it's definitely something that has been, especially for English and math since they implemented first, that people have been scrutinizing the non-passing grades at a much higher level, because now we see them, right? Because they're in these transfer level courses and we see if they're not passing, where in the past, if they were in basic skills, they usually had, pretty good passing rates, but they may not enroll in the next course in the sequence, which technically is a failure if they're not getting to the next level. And so we weren't scrutinizing those at as high of a level. So there's definitely been that focus, and we had a survey question around that, and colleges indicated that they are looking at those grades and messaging to students to encourage them to re-enroll in the class. We will be exploring that as we have more time through AB 705 for English and math. Since this will be we have the first full year of implementation, how did students do in the next course? I know at my own college, we've been looking at that for English and math, and we've actually found that even if a student places in a transfer level and doesn't pass, they're more likely to pass the transfer level course than if they had taken a basic skills course on their pathway. So we'll be exploring that for English and math, and then ESL as ESL goes into implementation as well. Bonnie, Olga, are you guys looking at any of that?
I would just kind of +1 everything you guys just said. I agree. I think in the past, the students who didn't pass were kind of just not really taking a second look. And now that I think that's another kind of thing emerging from AB 705 is now there's actually a question about who is not succeeding and why, and how do we support them. So yeah, I agree with Mallory. I think moving forward, I think that's going to be like an important question. It's for students who struggle in this new policy landscape, and even you know, do they repeat? Do we bundle different types of supports for them? It's kind of a closer examination, and I think that's kind of a very important discussion that has been sparked, and definitely we're going to continue to monitor it.
Yeah, there are a lot of implications for how we teach when we realize that not all students are initially successful, and so that there is a population of students that we want to encourage to try again, and it's not uncommon that students will be successful in their second attempt. We have looked at least some of that at the transfer level. When we're looking at throughput, we see when we include second attempts, throughput rates go up. So we do have students that are successful on second attempts at transfer level. We haven't really looked at that deeper in the ESL sequence yet. I had one thing I wanted to bring up or talk about that came to mind listening to Bonnie and Olga present. And this was the kind of the conversation that was going in the chat around the transfer level English equivalent ESL classes that are transferable. And what we had seen historically is a high level of repetition of that. So students take that class, and then over 60%, about 2/3 of those students take the English transfer level composition class as well. And historically, that may have been because those classes they transferred to the CSU, but they weren't IGETSI articulated, so they would not transfer to the UC. And I think the 7, and Kathy clarified for me, the 7 that Kathy Wada posted all transfer to both the CSU and the UC. So that's relatively new, that they're all transferring to the UC now as well. So that's just kind of amazing, good progress. And so we look forward, but the data in our data set predated those changes. So the data that we were looking at, it was still just transferable to the CSU.
Agree. Yeah, that's, I think, another promising thing. We feel the same way, that I think in the past, we found over half of the students who took these courses also ended up taking the college comp course. And I guess, and another thing that we saw happening even amongst these 5 colleges, they actually stopped offering them, you know, so we reached out to one of them to try to understand kind of their thought process for offering this transfer level ESL equivalent. And we learned that they actually had stopped offering it and had instead developed a section of the college comp course geared towards English learners. And so in just hearing that, we imagined that was probably going to be the direction. And so Irvine Valley, for example, is a case where that took off, but it is really promising to see that this other approach is actually gaining traction and getting the IGETSI credit that was probably holding some students back and resulting in potentially accumulation of excess credits because they were ending up taking more transferable credits to achieve their goals.
I saw a question in here that asked, I think maybe for Olga and Bonnie, if you could expand on the research conducted on the seamless connection between the non-credit and credit ESL.
Yeah, so for our study, what we did was we looked only, so if a college had a non-credit portion of their ESL sequence that was a prerequisite to the credit course, that's kind of how we included those non-credit courses as part of our study. So what we saw there is that we did see some attrition when this transition happened. We didn't do a deeper dive into, say, having conversations with the colleges that were actually hosting these sort of sequences. So I think that's probably definitely a space for future research, especially because we did hear that colleges were thinking about this as an approach to being compliant with AB 705, because they still felt, I mean, I think the argument that we often hear is it takes about 7 years to learn a language. So, you know, so the need for low, you know, more ESL, so they feel there's a demand potentially. So I think we want to continue monitoring it and seeing whether we continue to see this higher level of attrition when those transitions happen, and if not, who's having success in creating these sequences. So yeah, so I think we like, just to kind of summarize again, we looked at it in the quantitative phase. We didn't dive deep into kind of exploring precisely how colleges were ensuring these sequences. The high attrition suggests that more work probably needs to happen, especially as colleges feel that this is an approach that they're gonna take in response to AB 705. I don't know, Mallory and Craig, did you guys have a whole report on non-credit? Does it link to the credit ESL at all, or is it just kind of for the students that are just in non-credit?
There's a relatively, quite a low rate really of transition from non-credit to credit. So I think your point about there's a seam there and that is maybe not as seamless as it could be. And it's understandable when we have different organizations for non-credit, different curricular processes for credit and non-credit, that the articulation may not be seamless. Ryan's chiming in saying non-credit's free. You need access to financial aid for credit classes. Yeah, so there's some maybe demographic factors that need to be navigated as students move from non-credit to credit as well. The question of mirrored credit, non-credit ESL programs. I don't think MAP has not looked at that question yet, Barbara. PPIC sorry, Olga, has PPIC looked at mirrored credit, non-credit in any of your research?
We identified a few cases where colleges were mirroring. So that means that, you know, they're basically parallel sequences. The only difference is sometimes even sitting in the same classroom, some students may be taking them for credit and others non-credit. I believe in the main report, we do have some information. I would encourage you to take a close look at our appendix. We did find a small number. I think we didn't profile in the main report because it was a small number of colleges that had these mirrored sequences. And I'm almost positive that they did actually have somewhat slightly better progression, and it probably is the fact that they're free. So and they're also repeatable. So if students need to take them more than once, they're I guess less high stakes.
Well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so I think we probably should wrap up. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much to our presenters. This was fantastic. As I mentioned, we will post this on the CAP publications page. So once the recording's available from Zoom, we'll put everything up there. We do have 2 more webinars coming up in our series. On October 16th, the topic will be Real Talk, discussing complicated issues in the beginning ESL classroom. And then on November 13th, we'll have window into ESL designated models of freshman composition. So kind of looking at some classroom practices in the next 2. I will be sending out a follow-up survey just to get your feedback on the webinar in just a few minutes. So if you could take a moment to fill that out. Thank you so much for being here late on a Friday, and I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thanks, Summer. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.